All right, let's dive into some pretty dark history for this deep dive. We're going back to 1970s San Francisco to explore the zebra murders,
Yeah.
using the Wikipedia article as our guide. And let me tell you, it's a wild one. So imagine San Francisco, a city known for being pretty progressive. And suddenly everyone's terrified because of these brutal killings that seem totally random. And they're all targeting white people. At least 15 confirmed victims, but some people think it could be as many as 73 or even more.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in for sure. I think what makes it so fascinating and disturbing is what was happening at the time. You have all this cultural change happening. You know the civil rights movement, and then suddenly there's all this violence, and it just throws everything into chaos.
Yeah, for sure. So where do we even start with something like this? I guess we should start with talking about the victims. The first case that I think really shocked the city and kind of showed just how horrible these murders were
Yeah.
was the murder of Richard and Quinta Haig on October 20, 1973.
Yeah, that case was really important. It showed just how brutal these killings were. Richard and Quinta were walking home when they were kidnapped.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, forced into a van. And then Quinta's body was found on a railroad track. She was almost decapitated, and Richard was found alive. But he was really badly hurt.
It's just awful.
Yeah.
And to think that wasn't even the first attack. There was that attempted abduction
Yeah.
of those young boys. That seems like it was maybe a warning sign of what was to come.
Right, exactly. The violence was escalating, which is something we see happening over and over again.
Yeah. So in the next few months, this really scary pattern starts to emerge. You have victims of all ages and from all walks of life. A PG&E worker shot and killed in the middle of the day, an elderly man shot in a laundromat, even two young Salvation Army cadets. Tom Rainwater and Linda Story were attacked. Tom, unfortunately, didn't survive. It's like anyone could be a target.
Exactly, and that's what made these murders so terrifying. It seemed totally random. There was no reason for these attacks. This wasn't like some other cases where the victims were all part of the same group or there was some clear motive. It felt like anyone could be next, and that's what really scared people.
Right. It makes sense. And then they found John Doe, hashtag 169, a dismembered body at Ocean Beach,
Mm.
which just added to the horror. It seems like the killings were getting more and more violent.
Yeah. And although it was hard to figure out why these murders were happening, there was one thing that started to connect them. A lot of the attacks involved .32 caliber pistols, which was a really important clue that would eventually help investigators find the people responsible.
I can imagine what this was doing to the city. People must have been too scared to even leave their homes at night.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I bet tourism plummeted.
Absolutely.
And the nightlife.
The city was famous for its nightlife, and all of a sudden it was gone. Everyone was just too afraid.
The zebra murders just cast a shadow over everything.
Yeah, they did. The city was desperate for answers. They just wanted the killings to stop. And all that fear led to a really controversial response from the police. Operation Zebra.
Ah, yes, Operation Zebra. That massive manhunt started in January 1974.
Mm.
And immediately everyone was arguing about it. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little about what happened and why everyone was so upset about it?
Sure. So the police were trying to catch the killers, and they decided to stop and search anyone who looked even a little bit like the suspects, which basically meant any black man in San Francisco.
So they weren't even looking for specific people. They were just racially profiling people.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened.
It's hard to believe that could happen in San Francisco. It's a city that's supposed to be so progressive.
I know, but it did. And as soon as it started, people got really angry.
I bet.
Civil rights leaders like Bobby Seale from the Black Panther Party, they immediately said that Operation Zebra was racist. The ACLU was worried about whether it was even constitutional, and there were protests all over the city.
I read that Mayor Alioto was even attacked at one of the protests. It sounds like things were really tense.
Oh, they were. The NAACP and the ACLU filed lawsuits to try to stop Operation Zebra. They said it was violating people's civil liberties. And while the city said that they had to do it to stop the killings, it definitely caused a lot of damage. There was a huge divide between the police and the black community, and it took a really long time to fix that.
So in the middle of all this chaos, we have an informant who comes forward, Anthony C. Harris. What did he have to do with the Zebra case, and how did he change things?
Harris was really important. He gave investigators a lot of information about the murders and the group behind them in exchange for immunity and witness protection. He basically became their inside man. He showed them what was happening.
But even with Harris's help, there was still a lot of drama. Didn't Mayor Alioto almost ruin everything? When he tried to tell everyone who the informant was, what was he thinking?
It was a huge mistake. Luckily, the information didn't get out. And with Harris's help, the police were able to arrest some people. 7 men in total. although 4 of them were later released because there wasn't enough evidence against them. But at the Black Self-Help Center and at an apartment connected to the suspects, they found some pretty disturbing things. Weapons, rope, plastic bags.
It sounds like they were getting close to catching the killers. But how did the trial go? What happened to the zebra killers in the end?
That's where things get even more complicated, and the story takes another really dark turn.
Yeah, so we have this city that's completely on edge, this super controversial police operation. And finally, they make some arrests. So what happened next? I know the trial was huge.
Oh, yeah, it was a really big deal. It was all over the news. The whole country was watching to see what would happen,
Right.
trying to understand how something like this could happen.
At the center of it all were these 4 men, Manuel Moore, Larry Greens, Jesse Lee Cooks, and JCX Simon. They call themselves the Death Angels, which is just a terrifying name.
Uh-huh.
What did we learn about them during the trial?
Well, the prosecution said that the Death Angels were like a reverse Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, wow.
They said the group hated white people, and they even targeted black people who they considered dissident.
Dissident.
Yeah, meaning black people who didn't agree with their extreme views.
So they were basically racist.
Exactly. And one of the most important pieces of evidence in the trial was the testimony of Anthony Harris.
Oh, right, the informant.
Yeah.
He must have said some pretty intense stuff.
He did. His testimony was really captivating. He talked about how the group worked, their beliefs, and their plans for more attacks. He talked about how obsessed they were with numerology and how they believed that killing white people would bring them closer to God.
Wow. I remember reading about what Harris said about Queen of Hague's murder. It was just horrifying.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the most disturbing parts of the trial. Harris described how Larry Green, one of the defendants, grabbed Queena by the hair, dragged her away from the van, and then hit her over and over in the neck with a machete.
Oh my God.
It was a really awful description, and it just showed how brutal these crimes really were.
Besides Harris, did anyone else give a memorable testimony?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Linda Story, who was one of the Salvation Army cadets, who was attacked along with Tom Rainwater, she also testified.
Right, she survived.
Yeah. And her testimony was really powerful. She talked about how terrifying that night was, how sudden the attack was, and the pain she felt after losing Tom. Her story really showed the human cost of these murders.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the details
Yeah.
of the investigation and the trial, but it's important to remember that real people were hurt by this.
Exactly.
Was there anyone else?
Michael Armstrong also testified.
Oh, right, he sold the murder weapon.
Yeah, he said he sold it to Thomas Manny.
Who was the manager of the Black Self-Help Center.
Right.
And he was one of the men who was arrested, but then later released.
Exactly.
It's crazy how complicated this whole case was.
It really is. The trial lasted for over a year. It was one of the longest and most expensive trials in San Francisco history.
Wow, over a year. Must have been so hard to be a juror on that case.
It would have been incredibly tough for everyone involved, but in the end, the jury found the defendants guilty on all counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy.
Wow. So justice was served?
Yeah, at least legally speaking.
What happened to the 4 men who were convicted?
They were all sentenced to life in prison. But the story doesn't end there. 2 of them, JCX Simon and Manuel Moore, died in prison.
It's kind of like a Greek tragedy.
Yeah, and more recently, Jesse Lee Cooks died in prison in 2021.
So only one of the zebra killers is still alive today.
That's right. Larry Green is still in prison, and just last July, he was denied parole.
It's amazing that this case is still making headlines.
I know, even after all these years.
I guess it just shows how much of an impact the zebra murders had on San Francisco.
Yeah, it definitely exposed a lot of the racial tension in the city. It led to that really controversial police operation, and it left a lot of people traumatized.
And even though the trial is over, and the people who did it were convicted, there are still some unanswered questions, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Remember how some people think there might have been as many as 73 victims? Yeah, that suggests that there might be more to the story.
Right.
Were there other members of the Death Angels who were never caught? Were some of the crimes that were blamed on the zebra killers actually unrelated? We might never know for sure.
That's kind of scary. So where do we go from here? What are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
That's a good question. It's hard to know what to make of a case like this. It's so complex and disturbing.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that something like Operation Zebra could actually happen in San Francisco, a city that's supposed to be so progressive.
It really shows how easy it is for people to forget about civil liberties, especially when something scary is happening.
Yeah, I guess when people are afraid,
Yeah.
they'll do just about anything to feel safe.
Right. Exactly. So do you think Operation Zebra was the right way to handle the situation? That's a tough question. Some people say that it was necessary, that it was the only way to catch the killers.
Yeah, I could see that.
But other people say that it was just wrong, that it was a clear example of racism, and that it just made things worse for the Black community.
Yeah, I can see that too. So what do you think?
It's hard to say. I think it's important to remember that the police were under a lot of pressure to stop the killings. But at the same time, they can't just ignore people's rights.
Right. It makes you wonder if something like that could happen today.
Yeah, it's a scary thought.
Are there things in place now to make sure that the police don't go too far?
I think so, but it's something we always have to be careful about.
Yeah, for sure. We can't just assume that our rights are protected.
Exactly.
I have to be willing to speak up if we see something that's wrong.
I agree.
It's kind of a scary lesson to learn from this case.
It is. But I think it's an important one.
This whole thing just makes you think
Right.
about policing
Yeah.
and racial justice and how technology is being used to watch people.
Yeah, it really did.
The zebra murders were a long time ago,
Mm-hmm.
but they're still relevant today.
Absolutely.
They show us.
That we're still dealing with some of the same issues that we were dealing with back then.
So what can we do to make sure that something like Operation Zebra never happens again?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it starts with education.
Like learning about history.
Right, and understanding how fear can be used against people.
Right.
We also need to talk about race and prejudice,
Yeah. I know.
and we need to be willing to stand up
Yeah.
when we see discrimination happening.
It's almost like the zebra murders are more than just a true crime story.
Yeah, I think so.
It's about our society,
Mm-hmm.
about how we treat each other, and about making sure that everyone is treated fairly.
Exactly.
Well, this deep dive has been really interesting,
Yeah, it has.
but it's also been pretty disturbing.
I agree.
It's scary to think about how something like this could happen.
It is. But I think it's important to remember that we can learn from the past and that we can use what we learn to make things better in the future.
That's a good point. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you next time.